politicians haven't yet addressed the fundamental causes. And so this report is extraordinarily welcome, looking at inequalities in health within and between countries, and at the social determinants lying behind that. I want to really, I suppose, run through a sort of mixed picture that's come out of our work that went into our book, The Spirit Level, and also into the more recent one, The Inner Level, which is really on the psychological effects of inequality. So I like often to start off with this slide, and I'm afraid if you heard me in Dublin, you'll hear much of the, one or two slides are different, but most of them not. The contrast between how we pose for photographs, all smiling and happy, and how we appear if you take pictures of people when they're not aware that they're being photographed. This is London, which I think is a bit more miserable than other cities and other countries, but everyone there looks as if they're about to have a nervous breakdown and so on. It's a sort of gestalt switch between two views of what modern life is like. Actually, I think the second picture, the lower picture, is in some ways nearer the truth. The Mental Health Foundation reported a couple of months ago, saying that 3/4 of the population, at least in Britain, I think that will be a bit worse than other countries, but today we have a Lancet Commission report on mental health worldwide, talking about the crisis in mental health and how rates of mental illness have been rising almost everywhere, saying that I think 13.5 million deaths each year are basically attributable to mental illness. And 3/4 of us so stressed that we feel overwhelmed and unable to cope. A third with suicidal thoughts, and half that number have actually self-harmed sometime in their lives. I think that I'm going to talk about inequality. That's what most of my career has involved. As I say, when I first became aware of health inequalities in the 1970s, I did assume that our job doing research was to show the connections between the social and economic inequalities everyone accepts and death rates from different causes. What has surprised me and surprised others working in the field with a view which wasn't there initially at all, is how important chronic stress is, and really the psychosocial influences on health through chronic stress. I think when people like Blair, Tony Blair, dropped concern with inequality, though he maintained an interest in raising the incomes of families with children and reducing child poverty, I think he and perhaps many other people on the left thought that inequality perhaps had been important in the 1930s, when everyone lived in, or so many people lived in, awful squalor. Then it was perhaps wrong for other people to be living in great luxury. But now, if you look at the bottom 20% of the population in most developed countries, you know, they're living in reasonable houses with central heating. They might have difficulty to afford to run it, but they have all the electronic gadgets and so on. And so I think there was an idea that maybe now that the absolute poverty levels and squalor has diminished so much, despite the reappearance of food banks and so on, that maybe inequality doesn't matter anymore. What I think was missing from that picture was the psychosocial effects of inequality. I think there's a very naive view of inequality, that it only matters if it creates absolute poverty. But actually, I like to point out that a more accurate view of the effects of inequality is that it's really important because it creates those feelings or increases those feelings of superiority and inferiority, dominance and subordination. It underlines the idea, emphasizes the idea that we are all of different worths, makes us more willing to judge each other's personal worth from signs of external wealth. And it's that I want to talk about, as I say, the psychological effects of inequality. I found this graph on Google Images and felt that at last people were, maybe one or two were beginning to understand. I'm going to show you that graph in quite a few different forms with different health and social problems up the side. I'd like to run through many more than I have time for. But basically, a whole range of problems increases when income differences get bigger. We use data simply on the gap between top and bottom, 20% in each country, downloaded from the UN Human Development Report. It doesn't really matter which measure of inequality you use. It doesn't really change very much where countries are. It makes small differences, but it's not crucial. And rather than downloading the figures they have on the Gini coefficient, this measure of inequality, the gap between top and bottom 20%, is something everyone understands. And its effects on health and social problems, I think it's summarized really here. We took simply figures for each country on life expectancy, the OECD PISA figures on maths and literacy scores of young people, infant mortality rates, rates of homicide, imprisonment, teenage birth rates, trust, obesity, mental illness, which, by the way, includes drug and alcohol addiction in the standard psychiatric diagnoses, categorization, and some figures on social mobility. And the more unequal countries on the right doing less well on all of those. And in case people thought we were picking and choosing problems that suited our argument, we also looked at the Unicef Index of Child Wellbeing. It has about 40 different components. We looked at an earlier measure, and this one we published the earlier measure looking at its different components in relation to GNP per capita and in relation to inequality, showing that inequality is overwhelmingly more closely related to the vast majority of its components. When I say its components, I mean things like immunization rates, bullying in schools, how they do in the maths and literacy tests, whether kids feel they can talk to their parents, all those things, much more strongly related to measures of income inequality than to GNP per capita. And we also looked at changes over time between the earlier and the later measures of child well-being, and just the same in the picture of countries which have had the biggest rises of income inequality, having falls in measures of child well-being. I think people find it very surprising that so many quite different problems are related to inequality, and we emphasize it's a causal relationship. I'll give you references later to two papers where we go through the now vast body of evidence trying to show why it has to be understood as a causal relationship. But basically what all these problems have in common, when I say all these problems, I mean the ones listed there, are that they all have social gradients within our societies. They're all more common at the bottom of the social ladder than the top. Basically, all we're saying is problems we know are sensitive to social status within our societies get worse when we increase the social status differences. I think the general picture of what happens with bigger income differences is that the gradients get steeper, and even amongst the well-off, the levels of attainment are lower. The differences are biggest at the bottom. Here, amongst poorer people, there are bigger differences between attainments in more and less equal societies. And just as an example, I've suggested you could have life expectancy or kids' maths and literacy scores up there. Of course, if you had measures of drug abuse, it would all be the other way round. But basically, what I think income inequality does, the best generalization you can make is to say that it steepens the social gradients, and throughout most of the income range, the line in more unequal societies lies below the other. That's why we emphasize that inequality does not just affect the poor, it affects the vast majority. Colleagues at the Harvard School of Public Health actually talked about inequality as a general social pollutant, because using multi-level models, they found its effects went so far up the income scale. We've now seen papers looking at that in relation to a number of different outcomes, and that's why I say this is the best generalization of how these different health and problems are affected by different amounts of income inequality. I say income inequality, it would be nice to have wealth inequality too. Gradually comparable figures are becoming available through the Luxembourg wealth study, but available for fewer countries on wealth inequalities. But the one paper I've seen using the few bits of data comparable data for different countries on wealth inequality shows a very similar relationship with health inequalities to what you get, and to overall levels of health as you get using figures of income inequality. So I think ideally we'd think about overall material inequalities. I think this is not something separate from class and status. Quite the reverse. I think that bigger income differences, bigger material differences between us make class and status more important. If you live in a society where some people are supremely important and others are regarded as almost worthless, I think it increases all those what I call downward prejudices, the forms of discrimination, the class consciousness, the importance of status, and as I will show later, that has impacts on mental health. I think most people think of the social gradients in different outcomes, you know, why kids in poor areas do worse or why they have worse health, as basically as if it was a result of social mobility. The vulnerable move down and the resilient move up, and that's all there is to it. It's a sorting process. I think that's the popular view of why there are social gradients in so many problems. And yet, what I like to say is if I sort people in this room by hair color, dark hair that side, light hair that side, a sorting process won't change the proportion of the population with any particular feature. So, however accurately we sort ourselves, as if through social mobility, it won't change the proportion of hair color or anything else in this room. I'm going to show that a lot of these problems are, well, they're all between 2 and 10 times as common in more unequal societies. And I think that means that these problems that are related to social status are primarily are substantially determined by social status differentiation itself. Now I want to read you a little quote from a study which interviewed people in poverty in both rich and poor countries, which really, I think, shows, and people always say, well, actually, when you're talking about the really poor, it's the material deprivation that matters. But even with extraordinarily awful levels of material deprivation, you see what comes through when people do these interviews are the sense of inferiority and of shame and of being looked down on. I'm going to read just a little bit from the conclusions of a study by, I think he's Robin Walker, where they interviewed people in poverty in Uganda, India, China, Pakistan, Korea, the United Kingdom and Norway, where poverty can mean either this kind of living or that kind of living. Totally different. In the study, they say respondents universally despised poverty and frequently despised themselves for being poor. Parents were often despised by their children, women despised their menfolk, and some men were reported to take out their self-loathing on their partners and children. Despite respondents generally believing that they had done their best against all odds, they mostly considered that they had both failed themselves by being poor, and others saw them as failures. This internalization of shame was further externally reinforced in the family, the workplace, and in their dealings with officialdom. Even children couldn't escape this shaming. For with the possible exception of Pakistan, school was an engine of social grading, a place of humiliation for those without the possessions that guaranteed acceptance. And for men, relying on others or on welfare benefits was perceived as a challenge to their sense of masculinity. A British father of two admitted, "I feel like shit. I'm the man in this relationship. I'm meant to be the man, to take care of the missus and my kids, and I don't." So clearly, if you're living in these conditions, the material factors are really important as well. But there are also the sense of being inferior, the sense of shame, the anxiety, and so on. When you're living in these conditions, obviously the material factors become much less important, but you're still left with our sensitivity to social status and of being seen and regarded as inferior. And so I argue that what we're really dealing with is our evolved psychological sensitivity to social status. And and the importance of social status to us depends partly on its importance in the environment. I'm going to mention that a bit later. Let me just show you a few examples of the components of that index of health and social problems. This is some Canadian epidemiologists working in Statistics Canada, who showed for American states and Canadian provinces that the more equal ones have much lower death rates. This age group of working age men, the relationships are closest there. They're close amongst women, they're close amongst children, but much less close in old age. They virtually disappear in old age. This comes from a study which shows the strength of the correlation at different ages. That's 0, and this is 65 to 90. So the correlations between death rates and inequality are higher at younger ages. It might be that the correlations are low when you get to old age because maybe the health of people my age are more influenced by our past experience of inequality. We know it's influenced by our past experience of social and economic status. And there are now studies showing that there may be long-term lag periods. Maybe if we could look at health in relation not to current inequality but past experience of inequality, maybe that would not be quite as weak as it looks. So we get these people have started working more on lag periods, trying to identify lag periods. There's quite confusing evidence. But there are meta-analyses of multi-level models of changes in health in cohorts as they age in relation to changes in inequality. covering the meta-analyses populations of something like 60 million people. So we can be very sure that death rates do respond to changes in inequality. Mental illness, you can see more mental illness in more unequal societies in this graph, in more unequal societies on the right. It's not people who've been diagnosed with depression or anxiety disorders. It's because that would be too influenced by how you accessed mental health services in different countries, or your recognition of willingness to recognize depression. It's based on randomized samples given diagnostic interviews. So you're asked about your sleep patterns, your sense of self-worth, whether you have friends, all sorts of things that have been found to be diagnostic of mental illness. And it's the percent of the population who've had any mental illness in the preceding year, and it goes from about 8% up to 25%. Big differences. This is another quite different outcome. Proportion of the population. The vertical axis is prisoners per 100,000 population on a log scale. There are tenfold differences in the proportion of the population locked up there, mainly due to differences in how punitive the penal system is. A little of it's more crime, but most of it is that you get sent to prison more easily and for longer in more unequal countries. I don't know whether that's because there's less empathy, more mistrust, or more fear up and down the social hierarchy, but it's something like that. I may say this work on the effects of inequality really started in the 1970s. The first papers showing that more unequal countries had worse health and higher homicide rates were published in the 1970s. There are now 300 or 400 papers looking at this. We carefully, we were very keen to simply to get the data out of the academic journals that politicians don't see, and many academics don't either, into the public arena. So we use the simplest possible statistics to make it as accessible as possible. There are 3 data sets, I think, now that these relationships between inequality and bullying have been shown. The differences are simply enormous. Here is 5% of 11-year-olds who've bullied others 2 or more times in the last month. So down there you've got about 2-3%, and up there you've got 20%. Really big differences, rather like the homicide figures that show tenfold differences, or the imprisonment figures. You know, I worked in health promotion in, when was it, about 1979, 1980, in the health service. We would have been delighted if we could have shown a 10% reduction in any problem we were trying to deal with. And we're talking about these huge differences here. Bullying is particularly, I think, indicative. We would love to have figures on bullying amongst adults which were comparable between countries, but we can't find any. But you see, when I talked about an evolved sensitivity to social position, think of an animal dominance hierarchy. You know, the baboon ranking system is a bullying hierarchy. Bullying is about status and position, and putting others down, competition for superiority and so on. So I do think that it shows, partly through epigenetics perhaps, how things get into even early childhood, but also through the nature of family life and so on. But I think it does mean that if we're interested in more equal opportunities for children, one of the most important things we can do is to reduce inequalities amongst their parents and in society more widely. I want to give you now a little picture of what I think inequality does to the quality of relationships in a society. And since, I suppose, the French Revolution or before, people have regarded inequality as divisive and socially corrosive. Some people have always had that intuition that inequality is socially damaging, that it's divisive. There are now quite a number of studies showing that community life weakens. It atrophies in more unequal societies. People have less to do with their neighbours, less involved in local community activities and so on. There are also studies which show we trust each other less. Quite big differences in trust. I mean, you've got about, what, 10%, 15 or 20% of the population feeling they can trust others there. And as I say, there are papers looking at over 100 studies just at health or homicide. You can't get good data on mental illness or teenage births or obesity for poorer countries. So we've concentrated on the countries where there is good comparable data. I may say we never produce the figures ourselves. We just download what OECD has or what the World Health Organization has and take their data. If they have data for one of the countries we're looking at, it goes into the analysis. We make no judgments. If it comes from those reputable organizations, we just use it. In no case did we try and make countries more comparable or choose which countries were included on that basis. I think based on the European Values Survey, so people are in more unequal societies. European societies are less willing to help the disabled and the elderly and so on. And so you're moving from societies with a good deal of reciprocity, where we are involved in each other, to societies where you get more violence. This is American states, Canadian provinces down there. Again, tenfold differences. We've got 15 homicides per million there and 150 there. And I think there are at least 60 papers looking at this relationship between homicide and inequality around the world. So these studies show what's happening to social relationships between us. And if you go to really much more unequal societies than the ones that where we included, places where we've given lectures recently, you find in Mexico with appalling inequalities, much higher than the US. You know, the bars on the windows, bars on the doors, razor wire around these fences and so on. Lots and lots of houses like that, showing people afraid of each other. And it's exactly the same in South Africa. An electric fence on top, and the notice says armed response. So it's threatening, basically. You may get shot if you caught climbing in. And if you remember that the studies of happiness and increasingly of health show that absolutely crucial is the quality of our social relationships. And a meta-analysis of 150 studies of health and friendship show that whether or not you have friends is at least as important as whether or not you smoke to survival in a follow-up period. And it's really an important factor. And of course the studies of happiness, just the same. They show our involvement with others, the quality of our relationships, how many friends we have, whether we're involved in community life, all highly, well, I was going to say protective of health, but of important determinants of happiness. So what inequality is doing is striking at things that are close to the heart of the quality of life. And I think that's particularly important now that with economic growth in the rich countries, measures of well-being no longer seem to be rising. And there's no longer any connection between changes in life expectancy and GNP per capita. And studies have shown whether you look at changes over 10, 20 or even 40 years, there's just about no relationship in the rich countries between economic growth, our rising levels of consumption, and what's happening to health. And so we've got to move towards thinking about the quality of the social environment as where we now turn to get real improvements in the quality of life. That picture I've just given you over those last few slides, it's extraordinarily confirmed by this data from Bowles and Jayadev, American economists, who've done this analysis both internationally that I'm showing here and amongst the 50 American states. Basically, what they've shown is that the proportion of the labor force in each country or each American state involved in what they call guard labor, that is security staff, prison officers, police, increases with inequality because they are the people we use to protect ourselves from each other. And I think it's as simple as that. And more recently, we've had these. This is 2014. Richard Late at Trinity Dublin, showing that levels of status anxiety, our worries about how we're seen and judged, our social position, varies between more and less equal societies. Along the bottom are deciles of the income distribution. So the poorest tenth of the population are there. The richest tenth of the population is here. And status anxiety is higher, obviously amongst the poor than the rich. I think that was European data as well. So we're beginning to, and what we surmised as the cause of the relationships we showed in the spirit level, based often on little psychological experiments which seem to be suggesting sensitivity to these sorts of issues. We are now getting the data internationally to show that actually that's right. The bigger income differences do raise these stakes about our worries about how we're seen and judged. And we also know from psychological studies, endless psychological studies, that the kinds that most stress us, most likely push up our levels of stress hormones, are specifically tasks which involve what they call social evaluative threat, your worries about how you're judged. And they say threats to self-esteem or social status where others can negatively judge your performance. And that's why public speaking is always thought of as so stressful. We now know how these kinds of stresses to do with status, our sensitivity to it, amplified by inequality, feed into mental illnesses. A paper by Sherry Johnson and colleagues, Sherry Johnson is at Berkeley in the States. Actually, look her up on YouTube and listen to a lecture or two. She went through an enormous literature on mental illnesses and personality disorders, looking for, she wanted to not only use self-reported evidence that people were particularly concerned with these conditions, particularly concerned about status, but experimental evidence and biological evidence that they were that social status issues were crucially involved. Behavioral system, apparently we have an area within our brain that of course animals have too, for dealing with social status issues. It's really important if you're subordinate to know you're subordinate, to know how you've got to behave in relation to a dominant, and the other way around obviously when you're dealing with a subordinate. those kinds of issues. And read James Gilligan, who was a prison psychiatrist in the United States, talking about really violent men. I remember he talks about one who is endlessly being put into solitary confinement because he's so violent. And James Gilligan says to him, look, why do you go on like this? And he says, every motherfucker on the cell block is trying to put me down. It's my self-respect. That's all I've got left. And I'll kill everyone if I have to defend it. You know, you see mild versions of that all the time. You know, people who are very sensitive to feeling put down, or people who feel that they are inferior, just accept their inferiority, lack of confidence, low self-esteem and so on, but also narcissistic behavior. You can behave in the opposite way. Instead of accepting your inferiority, if you feel worried about how people judge you, you can flaunt your achievements and successes, exaggerate them, bring them into conversation. You can get narcissistic. And so there are about 3 papers showing depression is more common in more unequal societies. These are American states. More unequal ones this end with higher levels of depression. I'm going to skip over that one. But also young people feeling endlessly worried about how they're seen and judged, that they're not pretty enough, not smart enough, not funny enough. And people getting completely cut off from the rest of us because they find social contact such an ordeal. The social comparisons are that strong. And I have a few quotes from people who I should try and be quick. They were taken from a website where people share their experiences, and one of them says, in social situations I shut down. I tend to be awkward because I'm scared of people judging me and not liking me, so much that I just distance myself. I hear people laughing and immediately think they're laughing at me, which is stupid, but I can't help it. Over the years I've learned to embrace the loner lifestyle. Someone else says, sometimes I avoid everyone and anyone because I can't stand the thought of them judging me. Third person, I'll have panic attacks over something as simple as going to the checkout at Walmart. I do self-checkout so I don't have to talk to anyone. Last one says, I'm extremely shy around both people I know and don't know. It hinders my everyday life so much that people think I'm making it up. I have no friends. It's hard for me to go anywhere. I always make sure I go shopping in the day. That way I can wear sunglasses or a hat. It's my security blanket from the social anxiety disorder. I get tongue-tied and sweaty when I feel like they're looking at me, like I'm some sort of freak. It's a living hell. I struggle with it all on a daily basis. Now that again is the extreme view. But these are all anxieties that I think everyone is aware of. And of course, working in public health, one's not looking for the sources of stress and anxiety amongst the bottom 5% or something. You're concerned with the most widespread sources of anxiety, and I think our awkwardness about how we're seen and judged that makes so many social interactions every day more difficult, and I think is one of the important things behind the decline in community life in more unequal societies. You could call it self-advertisement or bigging yourself up, putting yourself over as more important than you are, more successful than you are. The data is based on interviews with a random sample of people in different countries, and people are asked how they think they compare with others in their society. So, do you think you're cleverer than other people in whatever country you come from? Do you think you're more attractive? Do you think you're more generous? So you're asked to compare yourself with others. Thank you. Yeah, here's the. This is Yeah, the one I wanted. Self-enhancement. Again, related to inequality, more self-enhancement. People rate themselves more highly in relation to their national average in more unequal societies. It's very much like the joke that I think 90% of Americans think they're better drivers than average. I believe that it's only something like 60% of Swedes who think they're better drivers than average. But it's still too high. But in more unequal countries, people big themselves up, basically. And so as well as that going under, that feeling of inferiority, or you're fighting against it, there is this sort of narcissism. And we show they're both more common in more unequal societies. This is the schizophrenia graph, more schizophrenia, one of the sort of conditions that Sherry Johnson was talking about. But the way we big ourselves up most commonly is through the kind of car we drive, what part of town we live in, the clothes we wear, what kind of phone you have. There are now studies that show if you live in a more unequal area, you spend more money on conspicuous goods and cars and so on. And those are done internationally and amongst the American states. Very much as you'd expect. That isn't a sort of marginal thing. It's not small differences. You can see as this is debt rising. That's 1965 to 2000 and something here. As debt in the US went up, as inequality went up, debt rose too. The sort of pressure people feel to keep up with others. And it was, can't remember her name, an American economist who showed that people's their aspirational incomes, how much people feel they need to live the kind of life they'd like to lead, rose substantially with inequality.